Chapter 8 of Lavender and Old Lace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget. Lavender and Old Lace by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 8 Summer Days. The rumble of voices which came from the kitchen was not disturbing, but when the rural lovers began to sit on the piazza, directly under Ruth's window, she felt called upon to remonstrate. "Hepsey," she asked, one morning, "why don't you and Joe sit under the trees at the side of the house? You can take your chairs out there." "Miss Hathaway allers lets us sit on the piazzer," returned Hepsey, unmoved. "Miss Hathaway probably sleeps more soundly than I do. You don't want me to hear everything you say, do you?" Hepsey shrugged her buxom shoulders. "You can if you like, mum." "But I don't like," snapped Ruth. "It annoys me." There was an interval of silence, then Hepsey spoke again, of her own accord. "If Joe and me was to set anywheres but in front, he might see the light." "Well, what of it?" "Miss Hathaway, she don't want it talked of, and men folks never can keep secrets," Hepsey suggested. "You wouldn't have to tell him, would you?" "Yes'm. Men folks has got terrible curious minds. They're all right if they don't know there's nothin', but if they does, why they's keen." "Perhaps you're right, Hepsey," she replied, biting her lips. "Sit anywhere you please." There were times when Ruth was compelled to admit that Hepsey's mental gifts were fully equal to her own. It was unreasonable to suppose, even for an instant, that Joe and Hepsey had not pondered long and earnestly upon the subject of the light in the attic window, yet the argument was unanswerable. The matter had long since lost its interest for Ruth, perhaps because she was too happy to care. Winfield had easily acquired the habit of bringing her his morning papers, and after the first embarrassment Ruth settled down to it in a business like way. Usually she sat in Miss Hathaway's sewing chair, under a tree a little way from the house, that she might at the same time have a general supervision of her domain, while Winfield stretched himself upon the grass at her feet. When the sun was bright he wore his dark glasses, thereby gaining an unfair advantage. After breakfast, which was a movable feast at the Widders', he went after his mail and brought hers also. When he reached the top of the hill she was always waiting for him. "This devotion is very pleasing," he remarked, one morning. "Some people are easily pleased," she retorted. "I dislike to spoil your pleasure, but my stern regard for facts compels me to say that it is not Mr. Winfield I wait for, but the postman." "Then I'll always be your postman, for I do admire to be waited for, as they have it at the Widders'. Of course, it's more or less of an expense. This morning, for instance, I had to dig up 2 cents to get one of your valuable manuscripts out of the clutches of an interested government." "That's nothing," she assured him, "for I save you a quarter every day, by taking Joe's place as reader to your Highness, not to mention the high tariff on the Sunday papers. Besides, the manuscripts are all in now." "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, sitting down on the piazza. "Do you know, Miss Thorne, I think there's a great deal of joyous excitement attached to the pursuit of literature. You send out a story fondly believing that it is destined to make you famous. Time goes on and you hear nothing from it. You can see your name featured on the advertisements of the magazine and hear the heavy tread of the fevered mob on the way to buy up the edition. In the roseate glow of your fancy, you can see not only your cheque, but the things you're going to buy with it. Perhaps you tell your friends, cautiously, that you're writing for such and such a magazine. Before your joy evaporates, the thing comes back from the dead letter office, because you hadn't put on enough postage, and they wouldn't take it in. Or perhaps they've written 'Return' on the front page in blue pencil, and all over it are little dark, 4-fingered prints, where the office pup has walked on it." "You seem to be speaking from experience." "You have guessed it, fair lady, with your usual wonderful insight. Now let's read the paper. Do you know, you read much better than Joe does." "Really?" Ruth was inclined to be sarcastic, but there was a delicate colour in her cheeks, which pleased his aesthetic sense. At first, he had an insatiable thirst for everything in the paper except the advertisements. The market reports were sacrificed inside of a week, and the obituary notices, weather indications, and foreign dispatches soon followed. Later, the literary features were eliminated, but the financial and local news died hard. By the end of June, however, he was satisfied with the headlines. "No, thank you, I don't want to hear about the murder," he said, in answer to Ruth's ironical question. "Nor yet the summer styles and sleeves. All that slop on the woman's page, about making home happy, is not suited to such as I, and I'll pass." "There's a great deal here that's very interesting," returned Ruth, "and I doubt if I myself could have crammed more solid knowledge into one woman's page. Here's a full account of a wealthy lady's summer home. and a description of a poor woman's garden, and 8 recipes, and half a column on how to keep a husband at home nights, and plans for making a china closet out of an old bookcase. "If there's anything that makes me dead tired," remarked Winfield, "it's that home made furniture business." "For once we agree," answered Ruth. "I've read about it till I'm completely out of patience. Shirtwaist boxes from soap boxes, dressing tables from packing boxes, couches from cots, hall lamps from old arc light globes, and clothes hampers from barrels. All these I endured, but the last straw was a transformed kitchen." "Tell me about it," begged Winfield, who was enjoying himself hugely. "The stove was to be set in the wall," began Ruth, "and surrounded with marble and white tiling, or, if this was too expensive, it was to be hidden from view by a screen of Japanese silk. A nice oak settle, hand carved, which the young husband might make in his spare moments, was to be placed in front of it, and there were to be plate racks and shelves on the walls to hold the rare china. Charming kitchen." Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes shone like stars. "You're an awful funny girl," said Winfield, quietly, "to fly into a passion over a transformed kitchen that you never saw. Why don't you save your temper for real things?" She looked at him meaningly, and he retreated in good order. "I think I am a tactful person," he continued hurriedly, "because I get on so well with you. Most of the time, we're as contented as 2 kittens in a basket." "My dear Mr. Winfield," returned Ruth pleasantly, "you're not only tactful but modest. I never met a man whose temperament so nearly approached the unassuming violet. I'm afraid you'll never be appreciated in this world you're too good for it. You must learn to put yourself forward. I expect it will be a shock to your sensitive nature, but it's got to be done." "Thank you," he laughed. "I wish we were in town now, and I'd begin to put myself forward by asking you out to dinner and afterward to the theatre." "Why don't you take me out to dinner here?" she asked. "I wouldn't insult you by offering you the 'Widder's' cooking. I mean a real dinner, with striped ice cream at the end of it." "I'll go," she replied. "I can't resist the blandishments of striped ice cream. Thank you again. That gives me courage to speak of something that has lain very near my heart for a long time." "Yes?" said Ruth conventionally. For the moment she was frightened. "I've been thinking fondly of your chafing dish, though I haven't been allowed to see it yet, and I suppose there's nothing in the settlement to cook in it, is there?" "Nothing much, surely." "We might have some stuff sent out from the city, don't you think so?" "Canned things?" "Yes, anything that would keep." Aided and abetted by Winfield, she made out a list of articles which were unknown to the simple minded inhabitants of the village. "I'll attend to the financial part of it," he said, pocketing the list, "and then my life will be in your hands." After he went away, Ruth wished she knew more about the gentle art of cooking, which, after all, is closely allied to the other one, of making enemies. She decided to dispense with Hepsey's service, when Winfield came up to dinner, and to do everything herself. She found an old cook book of Aunt Jane's, and turned over its pages with new interest. It was in manuscript form, and seemed to represent the culinary knowledge of the entire neighbourhood. Each recipe was duly accredited to its original author, and there were many newspaper clippings, from the despised woman's page in various journals. Ruth thought it would be an act of kindness to paste the loose clippings into Aunt Jane's book, and she could look them over as she fastened them in. The work progressed rapidly, until she found a clipping which was not a recipe. It was a perfunctory notice of the death of Charles Winfield, dated almost 18 years ago. She remembered the various emotions old newspapers had given her when she first came to Aunt Jane's. This was Abigail Weatherby's husband. He had survived her by a dozen years. "I'm glad it's Charles Winfield instead of Carl," thought Ruth, as she put it aside, and went on with her work. "Pantry's come," announced Winfield, a few days later. "I didn't open it, but I think everything is there. Joe's going to bring it up." "Then you can come to Sunday dinner," answered Ruth, smiling. "I'll be here," returned Winfield, promptly. "What time do we dine?" "I don't know, exactly. It's better to wait, I think, until Hepsey goes out. She always regards me with more or less suspicion, and it makes me uncomfortable." Sunday afternoon the faithful Joe drove up to the gate, and Hepsey emerged from her small back room, like a butterfly from a chrysalis. She was radiant in a brilliant blue silk, which was festooned at irregular intervals with white silk lace. Her hat was bending beneath its burden of violets and red roses, starred here and there with some unhappy buttercups which had survived the wreck of a previous millinery triumph. Her hands were encased in white cotton gloves, which did not fit. With Joe's assistance, she entered the vehicle and took her place proudly on the back seat, even while he pleaded for her to sit beside him. "You know yourself that I can't drive nothin' from the back seat," he complained.